Wow, we're so glad that you made it into the Six Screens Tele-Network here on Sunday. Is like we say, we do something that's different than Saturday night. We get into the scriptures, we get into theology. Now, you've been in the Watchtower, many of you. You have to have questions. I cannot believe that you left the Watchtower and do not have questions dealing with their theology and their false teachings. So, by all means, I'd love to have you, and Jay would as well. Call into the program today. The telephone number will be right there on the bottom. I'm going to get that ex-Jehovah's Witness shares a story out of this, Michael King, but we're going to put the telephone number right there, and you'll be able to see that and call up Jay, talk to him, or you can also just in the chat give him a question. He'll be glad to answer it for you. So let's bring Jay on stage right now and make sure that everything's going well with him. Let's minimize myself and bring Jay on. Okay, hold on 1 second, Jay. I'm maximizing. I got to minimize. Okay, add to stage. Okay, I'm sorry. Jay, I think we got it now. Let me bring you on. They changed the. There you are. They changed the way we do things here, so still getting used to it. But looking forward to you, Jay, coming on. I'm going to put the telephone number up. We had that man's name, the Michael King. He was on an earlier show. So let's put up the right telephone number here for Jay. And Jay, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, I'm Jay Hess, formerly one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but that was a half a lifetime ago. And I confessed to having worshiped Jesus and telling other Jehovah's Witnesses that was okay to do it. That was at a time when I was associated with the writing department and had been associated with the research department before that. And I was found guilty because I confessed and I didn't repent. And so I was expelled. And of course, you know what happens when that happens. That messes up all your relationships and families and so on. But I did not give up on God. I sought out Christian fellowship. Now, having been going door to door for 23 years, I thought I knew what all the various religions believed, and I disagreed with so much of it. I thought, well, what do I do? Do I just hang back? Do I find, what do I do? And I knew that I should be looking, and I looked around for fellowship. At first, I found it amongst some other ex-J-dubs that got together at conferences, and that was nice. But I kept looking and found out that, well, I believed in myself that there had to be somebody else on the planet that had come to some really good conclusions and understandings of Scripture, and I just had to keep looking. And that eventually did work out, is that I found out that actually the problem I had as a Jehovah's Witness was that I'm knocking on doors of people that are in denominations or churches, and at that time, prior to the internet, they were not really well informed, and I was looking for those that were informed. And I happened to get involved with a large Southern Baptist church that was associated with a seminary, and the folks there were a bit better informed. And this was just at the beginning of the use of the internet. And through that, I met friends, people who were informed, who knew Greek, knew Hebrew, because it was associated with a seminary, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And it was a good start for me. And through that, I got involved in an associate member of the Evangelical Theological Society, which is the largest gathering or networking of seminary academics, all with PhDs, degrees in biblical topics, translators, seminary professors, teachers, people who know Hebrew and Greek, and they write commentaries, not on some following some prophet or priest or pope or something like that, but rather what does the Bible say? What are the facts about the Bible? And they all held to the Bible. They didn't have a long list of things that you had to believe in, that you had to sign up for a long doctrinal list. Is just be free, but just tell what the Bible says and stick with the facts. And I've been growing from that group ever since, getting their literature, their papers. They produce about 650 papers per year at the PhD level of Bible research, and it's been a great ride. And I just want to share some of that with others. So that's what I'm doing here. And if anybody wonders, would I ever go back to Watchtower? Oh no. They'd have to completely change and remove so much of the Watchtower, what it is, before it would be a safe place to go back to. But I do a fellowship. I'm a retired pastor. I was a pastor of a small evangelical church here in North Carolina in the Raleigh area. That's a tough job to do. I prefer making disciples. I prefer teaching, and that's what I'm trying to do here, is to do for others what I wish someone could have done for me in giving me answers to Bible questions. So that's what we do here. And we have questions from previous episodes of this. And if I run out of questions for those who are here in the room, then I go back and I will start out doing that with a question that came up last time that was of serious and real interest on something about the Gnostics. So we'll talk about that. And I still have a growing list of things from previous sessions. And if you have questions, you can type them in on YouTube, or you can call the number that's on the screen. Call in that number and ask a polite question, please. And then you *6, press on your phone *6 to unmute, give your polite question, and then mute yourself with a *6, and then we'll talk about those things. And you continue to ask more questions.
I can't wait for your answers to those questions. But I have a question, and I don't know if you've got file cards on this or not. One couple witness brothers talked to me years ago, and I noted to them that I could not find an unbroken line of light from Jesus to the modern congregation. I'm sure that once in a while somebody had the lamp of light, but I couldn't find a group. The more I looked at the chronology of early Middle Ages and back, the murkier it gets. Do you have any theories on chronology? Are the Middle Ages 300 years out of date? That kind of thing. Do you have anything on that?
I mean, since from the cross down till today, I mean, chronology on...
It's more murky before the Vatican.
Right. Well, there are writings of Christians from the time of right after Jesus. Of course, we have the Bible, but within a few decades, toward the last part of the first century, there are writings of early Christians that have been preserved. Not much. Then after the first century, then you get some more in the second and third century, still writings of early Christians. Justin Martyr is a good one, but there's others. There's whole volumes of a book called the Early Early Christians, Ante-Nicene Fathers, Early Church Fathers. There are writings, and you can read them. It can be interesting reading. I'm more focused on reading the Bible, but I have read some of the early church fathers. In fact, that was my assignment when I was writing for the Watchtower. They wanted me to do reading in the early church fathers to research the Trinity. Then down through time, once the Catholic Church got involved, then you get Catholic writings that dominate. And I'm not an expert on all the church history. It wasn't all very useful for me because it's just the thoughts and beliefs of people, ordinary people. Not a one of them is inspired. Not a one of them can raise the dead or walk on water. These are just persons groping, searching, trying to find out God, what the Bible, and hopefully looking at the Bible along the way down until our very day. So I have a small interest in church history, but there are records. There are indeed seminaries that have records, look at church history. There is a whole field of study on it, but I'm definitely not an expert on it, and I haven't followed much. But yes, there are persons who wanted to understand, but because of before the Gutenberg press, you couldn't. It was very difficult to get a copy of the Bible. You couldn't get one likely in your own language, and what you could get was likely in Latin, and these translations are so. So it's a tough road for many of the Christians down through time, from the time of after the apostles down to our time. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. I'm reading a book now called Barbarian Conversion. It's very interesting. It talks about early Europe and some of these pagan kings and Vikings and Scots and all, and their early conversions to Christianity. But the other thing that I'm real interested in is this chronology. I'm an actual historian. I've worked in archives, but there are people now that are saying the Middle Ages was much shorter. There's all kinds of crazy theories right now about time and calendars and who did what to whom. And you've helped me to see that there were those early church fathers and that was legitimate research. But I guess let's move on to those interesting Gnostics. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. All right. So let's do that. So the question came up about Gnostics, and first of all, is that in all my years of researching and also apologetics, the interest in the Gnostics barely gets any press. It's just not as interesting. And in my now 30 years as a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, there's very little written on the Gnostics, and there's not much of a challenge there. Like an atheist might challenge a Christian, or philosophy might challenge Christianity, or ethics, what's called theodicy. There's some significant challenges for Christianity, but the challenge from Gnosticism, from 3 John, that the belief system of not a parallel, but another belief system that was in parallel at the time that John was writing his letters, was we would call the Gnostics, who believed that they were the insiders. They had the knowledge. They knew the truth. There isn't much of a challenge. So I'm not an expert on Gnostics, but I did do some research. I do have material from ETS, Evangelical Theological Society, on Gnostics. Considered some of that. And again, what I'm passing on is what these experts who have done part of their study as a seminary professor who have studied Gnostics, this is what I'm passing on to you in a condensed form. In that the Gnostics appears to be not a religion. Those who had a Gnostic, the word Gnostic, gnosis in Greek, meant to know. They had the special knowledge that this was not a united movement. There are some things that they all had in common. Those that claim to be of the Gnostic type belief system, they had things in common. And the things that they had in common denied pretty much the Old Testament, denied the description of God and the spirit realm. There's some little similarities there, but a lot of rejection of the Old Testament thinking. So this would make them very different from the, I'll call it mainstream movement, Christian movement, that we know from the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those books describe Jesus as coming from a culture of Jews, people who believed in the Old Testament. The Gnostics would be a very different group, a belief system that was not compatible with the Old Testament, because these Gnostics had a very different view that that which is physical is bad. It's only that which is spiritual is good. And that immediately makes a difference from the Jewish, and then I would claim the Christian perspective of what the resurrection is. The what is the resurrection? It's considered a fundamental. You just read 1 Corinthians 15 to see it's a fundamental there, because Paul says so. And then in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, speaks of the resurrection being another fundamental. It's a primary belief. If you look at the scriptures as they have been, as we have them today, and I'm speaking of the scriptures that we can recognize and claim are our scriptures in the first few centuries, okay, the ancient manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that the resurrection is a physical resurrection. That alone says that the Gnostics and the Christians are incompatible, because a fundamental belief, the resurrection, is very different for Christians from what the Gnostics believed. There's more, but I'm trying to pick one very fundamental issue that there would be a real difference, not in something minor, little bitty footnote, but rather a major issue, which is with the traditional Christianity, is that Jesus died and rose again. And when we say rose again, he became physical. That is something that would have been denied and rejected by the Gnostics. So there's a list of differences, and there's more. And I went and did a AI search and gave me a whole list of differences, but that's the one that jumps out. Another lectures that I've heard about the Gnostics is that they reject the idea of a one supreme God who created the universe and did what the Old Testament Bible says he did. The Gnostics, no. Their foundation would not be on the Old Testament. In fact, it's not even compatible with the Old Testament. They make this God of the Old Testament to be a bad guy. So there are similarities, and for example, they refer to a savior type figure. Okay, and I haven't explored this, what they said in Greek. I don't think there's much written in Greek. There's more in Coptic, and I do not know Coptic. That an idea of a Christ or Savior. Now, when we hear the word Christ, we think of, that's Christian. Okay, wait a minute. The word Christ is a Greek word. It was not invented by what we call Christians. It is not a religious term. It is not Jesus' last name. Christ meant anointed or chosen. So if someone says, well, I believe in a Christ, that does not, technically what that word actually meant in Greek does not mean that they're anything like Christians at all. Because we call ourselves Christians because it's mentioned in the book of Acts and it became a label that we use. But it meant those who follow this fellow who was anointed by God. Well, Roman emperors also claim to be Christ of a sort. So separate in your minds this term Christ. Just because someone uses the term does not mean that they have really any connection with Christians or Christianity as we call it today. So another interesting part of this, trying to address this topic, why is there interest in the Gnostics? As I've personally met people who left their somewhat traditional view to go explore Gnostics, because it's an ancient group, ancient writings that had some common interests with mainstream Christians, which are the books of Thomas and some other books, Book of Mary, whatever. I don't know the full list that they were interested in, but at some point the Gnostics, whatever their background is, encountered Christians, because John, the book of John, 1st, 3rd John, says so. So we know that there was an interaction, and the existence of Gnostics were interacting and impeding mainstream Christianity, at least the Christianity that the Apostle John is teaching, and he says to watch out for them. We don't need them. That's not what we believe. What they claim to know and what it's different. So the Gnostics were rejected right from the time of the apostles. So the question has come up of, is there some other connection between Gnostics and Christianity? Is Gnostics the first religion and mainstream Christianity an aberration of it, or some kind of naturalistic explanation for one morphing into another? Here's a little puzzle, and you may not know the answer when I ask it, but actually you do know the answer. Since Gnostics started in Egypt, and you're thinking, is that Egyptian? Okay, well, remember, Alexander the Great from Greece, which is near North Africa, conquered a big part of Africa, including Egypt. And that spread Greek language and Greek thinking from Greece, land of philosophers. It gets extended and drawn into Egypt and Alexandria, Egypt. These are main centers of Greek philosophy and Greek thought. Now, in that place, were there any peoples there living in Egypt that had Christian ideas? Well, it turns out that there was a major player, I'll say, of a fellow who lived in Egypt, about 500 BC, who had some very Christian thoughts. And you know this guy, and you know his name, and you know what he wrote. His name, we pronounce it as Jeremiah. And he wrote a book that's called by his name, Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was a priest who lived in Jerusalem, and then at the time, just before the conquest of Babylon, coming and conquering that area, he and other priests fled to Egypt. And eventually, the Old Testament works of the Bible in Hebrew were translated into Greek and spread in Egypt, including the book of Jeremiah, which in there, chapters 30, 31, 32, and so on, have prophecies about a coming Davidic character who would bring a new covenant to reconcile his people. So here we have an early Christian living in Egypt, and this affected other people, even Gentiles, who spoke Greek, because we know this because the Jewish movement and then the Christian movement expanded in North Africa, in Egypt. And there's a little story here. This is in my lifetime. There was a tribe in South Africa called the Lemba tribe that claimed to have roots that go back to North Africa, back to 500 BC. And they claim to have roots that go back to the time and place of Jeremiah coming into Egypt and the growth of Old Testament Jews and then Christianity in North Africa, called the Lemba tribe. And they claimed that they had roots going back to the priests that came from Jerusalem. This was in Newsweek magazine. I don't have the date and publication in front of me, but it was in Newsweek magazine. That's a magazine that had news articles in it. And this got to the attention of Israel, scientists in Israel, geneticists in Israel, and they have been studying genetics. And you know there's a law based on the Old Testament law of Moses that Aaron and his tribe or lineage would be the only ones that were authorized to serve as priests. Now, they could marry outside of the descendants of Aaron, obviously. They could marry into with other Levitical, outside into the Levitical tribe of Levi. And this would still carry on, although they're not within the Jewish community. This would carry on their lineage, and you had to be able to trace your line back to Aaron. Well, Israelis studied this genetics, and through doing DNA mapping of Jewish people that claimed they could point to their lineage back to first century priests who would all be descendants of Aaron, they had isolated a genetic marker. Now, the Hebrew word for priest is Cohen, so they call this genetic marker the Cohenite marker, which is a marker that indicates that you are a descendant, in their opinion, a descendant from Aaron, the high priest. So they went and down to South Africa, got members from the Lemba tribe, and they all had the Cohenite marker. What does that prove, or seems to prove, is that there were folks from the Jewish priest line in Egypt, North Africa, and Jeremiah was there. These priests that went to Egypt would know each other because they would travel and get together and commune because they didn't want to be associated with the Gentiles. So these Jews stuck together. As a consequence, they end up having a tribe that bred, and they intermarry with other Egyptians, but they would propagate this, the tribe, or in this, the descendants of Aaron, would continue on, and they had Jewish beliefs for a time, but many converted to Christianity. Well, that's not a stretch, because Jeremiah is one of the priests that went to Egypt. His book has prophetic words in there, prophecies about a coming Davidic leader who would be a king. And what's the Greek word? Well, the Greek word for anointed, the Greek word for king is basileia. I think it's basileia, kingdom. And then, but one who is chosen and anointed, that's Christ, Christos. So they would have that belief. It spread. Other locals who were local to Egypt and Africa were influenced, joined this movement. This is where we get the Ethiopian eunuch who travels to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8. Okay, so we know it's spread, and this is scientific genetic proof that they existed, and it went all the way back to the time of Jeremiah. So again, genetic scientific proof. So my point is that there would be those in Egypt who held to views that were, in fact, the basis for some of the Christian beliefs, because that's where we find in Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant being promised to come. So it's not a surprise that there were Christian ideas in Egypt going back to 500 BC. Now, did those views and beliefs of these Jews contribute to this thinking of a coming Messiah and affect other Gentiles in the area? I don't know. There's no records that answer that question. We do know, though, that these views spread. You got the Coptic Church, which was Christian, which was there. And did this affect others? We can't. I don't know how to prove that one way or another. But just as we know that Muhammad was influenced by Christians, affected by Christians, and he was affected by local Jews where he lived, it is no surprise to think that, to believe that the early seeds of Christianity planted by Jeremiah affected others. Just from what I said, we know that it did affect, and eventually there were Christian movements in Africa, Egypt, and then Africa, and then eventually spread to South Africa. So this is not a big surprise. It does not imply that Christianity came out of Egyptian or Greek thought. What it does say is that when Jeremiah and others went to Africa in the 500 BC time frame, that these thoughts came from a Jewish source, spread to Greece, or at least the Greek people or Greek thought in Northern Africa, and spread. Okay, that does not say anything about that Gnostics morphed into Christians. It doesn't prove that at all. We can trace mainstream Christian thought just simply with the Bible, Old Testament, and then the New Testament texts that go back to late first century. And in the second century, there are fragments of our Bible, what we call the Bible, in existence, still in existence. So this isn't much of a challenge in my mind for Christianity. What is the challenge? Is the challenge that Christianity is an aberration of Gnostics? I'm more likely to think that Christianity is built on the Old Testament thinking because Jesus came out of Jewish community, and then Christianity grew because of Jesus and his preaching, as well as the preaching of the apostles and what God continued to speak and reveal through the apostles. Okay, and then you build on that, you get Christianity, and then different variations of Christianity down through time, going off in different branches, and that Gnosticism was just another Greek philosophical group that exposed to Christianity, exposed to Judaism, and they fold in their own thinking, we'll say pagan thinking, that's not based on Judaism, not based on Christianity, and they've got this philosophical approach, and it leads to what we actually see in the Gnostic movement, which is they generally reject the Old Testament, generally reject what the Old Testament claims God did and didn't do, and they came up with their own belief system, and that pretty much declined. We don't have a Gnostic church today that I've ever heard. So that's kind of where it is. I'm going to take a look at the questions that have been coming in. And as Maverick says, try and put QQQ at the beginning of your text so that I see what's being asked here. And I'm going to capture these questions that come in. I'm first going to look for things that are related to the Gnostic questions that we're already considering. All right. Maverick asks, when would be the earliest recorded records of Gnostic gospel? He says 2nd century AD. Yeah, that's all I could find is 2nd century AD, where it's identified as a Gnostic material. Well, that's down the road beyond after some of the early fragments for Christian writings. And are there similar thoughts? Okay, between those that hold a Gnostic thought, but it's not the same as Christian thought, but they have an overlap. So what is that supposed to prove? I don't see what that would prove. And then, okay, let's see. Again, 2nd century AD. Note to me, it says the known Gnostics also speculated, researched, and studied. Okay. Not sure what that question is about. Sorry, don't understand. In their opinion, you believe all these opinions and claims. Is your life guided today by ancient claims and opinions? My life is based on, as I'm studying the Old Testament and New Testament, and I have access to those who know Old Testament Hebrew and New Testament Greek. And I don't know when you say opinions, the statements in the Bible are not just some human opinion. I'm looking at those where there's evidence that this was what we call inspired Word of God. Okay. speaking of Moses and then Jesus and the apostles. So Gnostics believe that they'll keep reincarnating until they have awakened. They keep trapped in human form. I don't know about reincarnation, but that rather they believe that they go off to be spirits. I don't know if there's any reincarnation for Gnostics, but rather they die and they go off to a spirit realm. Well, that's not terribly different from what the Greeks believed. Plato writes about such things. They believe that when you die, your spirit goes off to the world where you get to the real truth. So that's Platonic from Plato thought. So what the Gnostics were teaching doesn't sound that different from Plato. It's not Christian thought. Christians do believe that when you die, just as Jews do, your spirit goes someplace, but that's not your final stopping point. Rather, there is something that comes later known as the resurrection. Here's a question. So the Gnostics believe that they remain trapped in human form, reincarnating until the awakening. Then at death, their spark reunites to the divine. There is no future self. Okay, that I think I understand. That I don't know about reincarnation. I didn't come across that, but they have to wait until there is their spirit is connected with the God. Okay. So Jeremiah knew nothing about the Christianity of the New Testament. The ancient Egyptian Christianity started with Ptolemy, the self-appointed savior. I need some facts there. I would say that when you say Jeremiah knew nothing, Jeremiah planted the seeds, the prophetic seeds of the coming Messiah. What we do know about what we say mainstream Christianity, the seeds of it are found in prophecy, in Daniel, in Jeremiah, okay? But then the actual teachings we find in the New Testament. Those teachings in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from Jesus have nothing to do with Ptolemy. So I'm not understanding the question or the claims here about Christianity. Mainstream Christianity that I know is based on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the teachings of Jesus, and then by extension it continues with the Apostle Paul. So now what did Christians in Egypt do with that? We read some history of what they did, but some of them could have been influenced by local Greek thought and philosophy. Well, I don't consider them to be mainstream Christianity that is solely based on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That would be what I would call mainstream Christianity. Okay. I think that's all the questions I've seen so far, but this interest in Gnostics hasn't been much of a challenge to mainstream Christianity that they have to defend some claim, because I've not seen yet any specific claims that push Gnosticism back prior to the time of Jesus. And I don't see anything that implies that Gnosticism morphed into Christianity. I would think it's much more likely that what was believed about Christianity, it was spread orally initially. It was an oral message that got spread, and it got spread to a lot of places. For example, Acts chapter 8, right? Philip talking to the Ethiopian eunuch, okay? And the Ethiopian eunuch learns some things and then goes back home to Egypt. Does he have the collection of the New Testament text? No, because they weren't written. All he had was some information passed to him orally with some core beliefs that the Messiah has come, etc. But he has to go back. So he goes back to Egypt, Ethiopia, and takes along with a message, and hopefully over time there is communication from Africa to the Jerusalem area. That would take time, and did some people invent some things that weren't in the Bible? Oh, that is certainly possible, that somebody back in Africa gets involved in Greek philosophy, says this is something, this is interesting, and they combine the two and they come up with some hybrid belief. Okay, but it's not. That's not what mainstream Christianity is. Not today, as we all are supposed to try and build what we believe on Scripture, Old Testament, which has the seeds of it, and then New Testament, where we have the clarifications from the Gospels, as well as the teachings of Paul and Peter and so on. Okay. Let's see. Seeing another question here. Danietta says, John 6:40, Jesus says that his Father's will is that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Last day of what? Oh, yes. What is the last day? Okay. As we study the topic of the last day, or the day, or judgment day, there is a plan, prophecies, and a plan where God has sketched out the future. We first see this in Daniel. Daniel, well, I guess Isaiah was written in kind of a contemporary Daniel's a little bit after that. So Isaiah has some of that. You have to dig into it and recognize it, but there is some of a time frame, time flow in Isaiah. Then we see it more in Daniel, especially Daniel 11 and 12, that there is a future time when everything is closed out and humanity is judged. And Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2, says that there's going to be a resurrection of everyone. Okay. Now, keep that in mind. Fast forward to the New Testament. We read the Gospels. Jesus speaks talks to Martha and Mary, and talks about, he says, your brother will rise. And she says, I know Lazarus will rise in the last day. This was a common teaching based largely on Daniel 12, a little bit on Isaiah, that there would be a final resurrection for everybody at the same time. That's what Mary and Martha said to Jesus. Of course, my brother will rise at the last day. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, mentions this idea that on the last day, and he's saying it to the common people, and they understood what he was talking about. This was not a new teaching. So when Jesus says it in the Sermon on the Mount, and when Jesus says it, talks later to Mary and Martha, this is not new. This is old stuff, and it is based on Old Testament prophetic things. It continues on. Paul talks about such things in 1 Corinthians 15. There is a last day. This is Judgment Day. It's a very interesting topic, and I have a chapter in my own disciple making course. I have a disciple making course. It's online as well, and it is listed as one of the fundamentals in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 2, where there's a judgment day, an everlasting. There, it's called everlasting judgment. So this is the time map, if you will, of. There's the reign of man, where the earth is dominated by humans, and then it comes to an end, and this is the last day. And according to Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:20 and following, on that last day starts the resurrection, a series of resurrections, because Paul says each is raised in his own order. So there's one right after another, and begins on the last day. So that's the last day, which I claim is what Jesus is referring to there in John chapter 6, verse 40. This was a concept that the Jews that he's speaking to already understood. Okay. Then SOS, here's the question. Paul's books were written first. 40 CE, he did not follow after the Gospels. Yeah, that's true. The Gospels were not put to print until later. Paul needs to write his letters. He's writing to individuals, sometimes individuals or individual churches. These are communications from Paul doing his ministry as he's traveling on his missionary travels, 3 of them. And he needs to keep in touch with them. So as he's gotten away from them, he has the urgency. He needs to write something. Now, in those writings, we can tell that it says that he'd been there for years. The book of Acts says so. And he had been there for years, preaching, teaching, and what he's teaching in those letters is not new. Well, there's some new things there, but he'd already been teaching this kind of thing to them for a long time. It's just that he had the need to write it soon, while the other books, the Gospels, did, as far as we can tell. It's hard to know for certain the year because it doesn't say when Matthew wrote his, when Mark wrote his. So these are approximations. So these are guesses as far as the date. We have some clues, but not firm clues. Paul's books are easier to date than the Gospels. So when was Matthew, Mark, Luke written? It's hard to say. Now we know John was written later because John says things that show a currency with a later time. And John is written to fill in the gaps that aren't mentioned in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, which are all very much alike. That's why they're called the synoptics, because they are all in synchronous about the same time. Okay? Let's see. Okay. All right. Someone is making a tough financial spot. And someone is writing here who's in a very tough financial spot. So maybe we can look into that. Doesn't give you any contact information, but it's someone that we can pray for in a very tough spot. Okay. It says Paul invented Christianity. The Jesus of the Gospels is now okay. That's not a question. I see no facts or references there. But from what we know of Christianity spreading to Africa in Acts chapter 8, Paul wasn't even around when that Christianity spread to Africa through Philip and others at that time and place. So I see no evidence to say that Paul, who came later than Acts chapter 8, invented Christianity. Paul preached the importance of telling the truth and not believing in Jewish myths. So Paul is not likely to be one who's inventing Christian myths. And how could he invent Christianity and cause people to believe that at a Passover where the sky went dark, how could Paul start a rumor amongst Christians or amongst Jews that would become Christians that the sky went dark and that Pontius Pilatus was in charge, and the high priests were involved in putting this Jesus to death, to the point that this appears in ancient records that there was a Jesus. They knew it and they had seen it, and he was raised from the dead and had these amazing teachings. How is that even possible? So if you're going to make a claim, you ought to ask it as a question, but give some of the facts that give evidence of how Paul could invent something that the Jews, who were a tight group, informed, kept close, would convert and abandon their comfortable lifestyles as Jews in a nice tight-knit community. Why would they abandon that, risk their lives, many of them being put to death and arrested and put sent either to the arenas to face lions or to the cross. Why? How could someone of an informed group that got together every year at Passover, how could you invent a new religion that would succeed in that? That I don't see any evidence for that at all. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions that I've overlooked. I didn't think so. Okay. All right. Okay. No, I don't see anything else. I always go back over these later to see if I've missed anything, but I don't see any questions. Yeah, some of these I don't think I missed any questions. Okay. All right, I think I've got them all. So I'm going to continue on. Maverick adds, Galatians 1, beginning of verse 8, affirms that Paul was interested in the same gospel message as preached before. Yes, it's reading the first 2 chapters of Galatians, and it is thought that Galatians is one of the first books actually put to pen and paper, of course, by Paul, that talks about his claim to have been in touch with those who knew Jesus, that were there at the beginning. Not that Paul was himself there at the beginning, but he knew people who were, and he mentions these people by name. So that's how could he invent Christianity by doing such a thing? That I don't get that. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Question here. Okay. Okay, to add to that, Maverick also adds the Galatians 1:8 about what if we are an angel? He says, don't believe someone that, no matter what claim they make of how central they are to Christianity, if it doesn't fit with the gospel that had been preached, already orally preached, of course, that person should be expelled. That's how important Paul held to the importance of being truthful and factual, because in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to the evidence. See, Paul was a very evidential person. He says you can still find upward of 500, some out of the 500 people that saw Jesus raised, some of those people still were alive when Paul wrote his book there at 1 Corinthians 15, that you could go and ask. Because of the Romans having built roads that stretched across the empire, you've heard the sayings, all road led to Rome. You could go from any part of the empire to another part by traveling these roads that connected the empire. You could travel to Jerusalem. In fact, there are ancient Roman roads still visible today. I've heard that excavators have gone there and identified the remnants of Roman roads that existed that could take you to Jerusalem. So that from any part in the empire, you could get to Rome and then take one of these roads down to the Roman roads down to Jerusalem. So you could do that. So what's they could check up on all these claims that Christians were making, especially Paul, and he points that out there in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay. Question. Says Apostle Paul, when debating to remain with them or to be present with the Lord, it appears Paul was expected to be with the Lord immediately after his death. Okay, yes, Philippians chapter 3, chapter 1, that Paul did expect, absolutely, at his death, that was not the resurrection, at his death, his spirit would be with Jesus. That was a common belief amongst Christians. Jews had an expectation that when they died, their soul or spirit, I'm going to use spirit, immediately went to go to a place called Sheol in Hebrew. That was something they believed. That's mentioned, right from early parts of the Old Testament, but clearly mentioned in Isaiah. This is what the Jews believed. You died, your soul or spirit, actually the Hebrew word repha is probably the better term. You go to be in this waiting place, waiting for the resurrection. Yes, Jews also believed in a resurrection. You can tie the resurrection back to the time of Abraham, when he was promised a son, and that promise came true. First, he was promised that his wife could get pregnant. That's the first promise. Then promised that he would have a son. That happened. And then God says, you're going to take and sacrifice your only son. Okay. The only logical conclusion that Abraham could make, according to Hebrews chapter 11, is that there must be a resurrection. We have evidence that that belief in the resurrection was propagated, because there is also evidence in the Septuagint that Job is a relative, maybe a close relative several generations down, but a relative of Abraham. And Job chapter 19, mentions the idea of a resurrection. So this resurrection has its roots in Abraham. It is mentioned and implied in God's promises to Israel in bringing back Israel, Jacob, others, bringing them back at a later time in prophecy, bringing back physically to the land, which would imply a resurrection. So that's all there. Okay, so yes, Paul was expecting to be with the Lord immediately after his death, but that's not the resurrection. All that we read about the resurrection, which I mentioned before, it would be the resurrection would happen on the last day. That's a corporate resurrection. Now, did the Jews believe in such things? Yes. How do we know that? Because in Acts 24:15, Paul says, before, as he's on trial here before a Gentile, he says, you see these Jews that are accusing me, they all believe in the resurrection, and I do too. We believe there's going to be a resurrection the last day of the righteous and the unrighteous. This shows that the Jews had a long-standing belief in the resurrection. You can gather that also from reading about Jews, the Pharisees, because the Pharisees clashed with the Sadducees, who did not believe in the resurrection. That's how the Pharisees stood out. Paul in Acts says he is a Pharisee, a son of Pharisee. So he had the same beliefs in the resurrection, which he repeats in Acts 24:15. So the resurrection was a future event. All the Jews generally, except for the Sadducees, believed in the resurrection, and it was a future event down at the last day. However, until then, when you die, your spirit, or better, the Hebrew word repha, goes on to another place, and for Christians, that went to be with Jesus. Okay, question here. SOS asks, Paul wrote, okay, the stories that we got from, he says Paul wrote first. Well, it was put to paper first. The stories, what the apostles went through, Matthew, Mark, and associate with Peter, and Luke, who was an associate of Paul and Peter. These were oral teachings for a while. The teachings came first before Paul wrote, but these were oral teachings. Eventually they were put in writing. And he says, Paul made no mention of the virgin birth. That's true. Paul made no mention of the virgin birth. He made no mention that the sky is blue or that the ocean is blue. He didn't need to. These were beliefs that were already known. The teaching that there would be a virgin, well, that's back in Isaiah, and that was in print. Then the Christians pointed to that prophecy and said, well, that applies to Jesus. So that was an oral teaching that was built on Isaiah, had spread since the days of Christianity after the cross. And so when Paul writes, he's not writing to teach people something that they had not known. Paul had already been on his missionary tours, and he was keeping the conversation going. So Paul, what he writes is, sadly for us, just a snapshot in time of a full-length movie, because Paul had been traveling and spending years at these congregations preaching, and we wish we had those on video, but we don't. What we have are these little snatches of what's in these letters that were written for specific purposes. Ink and paper was costly, and you want to write just what you need to write. He's not writing the same things over and over and over, or what he was preaching or had been preaching. He builds on what he had already been preaching, and that is where they would have heard of the virgin birth. The other things were true, they just weren't appearing in his letters because they'd already been orally taught. Then SOS says, Paul's Jesus is not the same Jesus of the gospel. I see no evidence of that. You're not presenting any evidence here. I see it. They are the same person. Says the person who wrote Luke is the same person who wrote Acts, right? So I see no evidence that the Jesus is different. The Jesus that I read in the Gospels, and I've studied this, is the same Jesus that Paul refers to. There's no difference. You may need to bring up, if you're going to have something specific, you need to be specific. Especially if you're going to make a strong claim, we need to see evidence. Okay. So Maverick is pointing that out. Where is your evidence? If you're comparing the Gospels with what Paul is writing, give me book, chapter, and verse. Okay. Danietta said, isn't the resurrection on the last day? Yes. For believers who died before Jesus. No, the resurrection on the last day is for all people. All people, good and bad. Because remember, Acts 24:15, Paul refers to the Pharisees, which he himself believed as well, that on the last day there would be a resurrection for all people, the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, Paul teases out some of the details in 1 Corinthians 15, around about verse 20, as well as 1 Thessalonians 4:15, and around about that the resurrection is done in order. There's a sequence there. All of it, though, the last day. What's called the last day. The last day is this period of when the end is the last day of man's reign over earth. The last day of man's reign is the last day because God puts an end to it, and Jesus comes back, and the first thing is the beginning of the resurrection in stages or in order. We get that from 1 Corinthians, again, 1 Corinthians 15:20, and the next couple of verses. Paul says that when he comes, which is end of the last day of human rulership, is Jesus returns, begins his rulership, and thus the first thing is the resurrection for everyone, which would include believers who died before his resurrection. It would include the believers, Moses, Abraham, and everybody who has lived and died up till the time of the second coming of Christ. All right. SOS comments, I'm guided by today's scholars. Well, he's reporting what some scholars say, but if you're going to make a claim of a difference between the Jesus of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and what Paul says, okay, the writings of Paul, then if you're going to be an evidential-based person who has critical thinking skills, you want to look at the evidence. What is the evidence? Some evidence is strong, some evidence could be weak, but it's like in a court. You're on the jury, you're looking to the attorneys to present evidence, things that can be identified, and you can examine them. Now, some evidence may be strong, some evidence weak, so I'm looking for evidence in order to make a decision about what is true and what's false. So at least to start there, I would want some verses in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then that is a contrast with something Paul wrote about Jesus elsewhere. That's where we would start. Then we could look at those verses, and maybe we have to talk about the Greek, maybe we have to talk about the context, maybe we have to talk about other things, but at least that's where we should start if we're going to have a conversation that is evidential, based on evidence. And Judaism was a religion based on evidence because of the strong law commandment that you had to have the testimony of two in order to, before you're even going to pay attention to someone's testimony. You got to have at least two. Otherwise, we may not pay attention to it. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that there were 500 people who saw Jesus raised from the dead, and some of them were still alive at the time Paul is writing his letter in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay. Let's see. Okay. What's the loving Lord God demand intense research? Okay. Me, the scholars. Either way, why must a loving Lord God demand intense research, speculation, and study of himself? God does not demand speculation. He does demand that we be asking, seeking, knocking, that we be seekers. The God asking us to be seekers starts when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. At that point, after they're out of the garden, if you want to know God, you've got to be a seeker to find out where is God. That's what he expects. That's Old Testament, starting with the Garden of Eden, all the way through. Who are the seekers? And God gives little breadcrumbs to follow and find him. And in the New Testament, when Jesus comes, big time, he talks about ask, seek, knock. You must be a seeker. And those who seek will find eventually. And then in the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, the writer of Hebrews says, you cannot please God unless you seek. You've got to be a searcher. You've got to be a seeker. Seek God. This is a requirement. This is what God is looking for. And hopefully you are a seeker. And if in this life you say, wow, there's so many troubles, I sure wonder, is there a God? Is there hope? Is there a future? All those questions. That's where God is starting. That's who God is looking for. If you are a seeker, God is looking for you. In John chapter 4, Jesus says these are the ones God is looking for, is those who are seeking, who want to know the truth. We're not going to just believe every little thing. Ephesians 4 says people do that. They'll believe in just any little thing that flies by because it looks interesting. But if you are a seeker, if you love God with your whole, this stuff between the two ears, your mind, and seek him with your life, your soul, your heart, but you need to seek him with your mind. Use your critical thinking skills. For me, I got my critical thinking skills from a pursuit of mathematics. That was the thing that I did in college, high school, college. That helped me refine my thinking skills. Throwing me in the Watchtower caused me to debate Christians, and then I go, some of the stuff the Watchtower pushes is wonky. And I used my thinking skills to walk away from the Watchtower. Let's see. Question. Let's see. Is a bodily resurrection when soul is reunited? Okay, when the bodily is reunited with the soul to be the whole person. Okay, that's basically yes. The bodily resurrection, as you look at the references to the resurrection, we look at Jesus' actual resurrection in Luke 24. That's a pretty good place to go to. And then Paul's has a whole chapter on it in 1 Corinthians 15. That was an issue because the pagans, the Greeks in Corinth, they don't believe in a resurrection. Now, the Jews would have. as I gave that little summation, starting with Abraham on down through, that is something Jews believed on, was a bodily resurrection. We find it in the book of Job. Probably Job is one of the first books put to pen and ink, but it's elsewhere as well. And so when Jesus comes, this idea of a bodily resurrection is not new. What would be new is the nature of that body, which they did not know and what it would be, although, yes, Daniel talks about an everlasting kind of life. Isaiah implies an everlasting life. So what would that life look like? They didn't know for sure, but Jesus showed what that would look like after his resurrection. So we look to Luke 24. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul fills in a little bit more than that. But what we conclude is that the Jewish idea of the resurrection was that there would be this, you could use the word soul. That's not as precise as I would like when I teach the subject, because there's some confusion, because there's 3 Hebrew words for this component of the person after death. They overlap. Nefesh, Ruach, and Repha are 3 Hebrew words. Greek, likewise, you have Suke, Pneuma, and Phantasma are 3 Greek words that correspond to those 3 Hebrew words. So at death, the Repha, Hebrew, or Phantasma, Greek, continues to exist. It's not evaporated, dissolved, and destroyed. It's not. That's not even a good pagan belief. They believe that would go on, but the Jews believed it as well. But in the resurrection, it is joined with a body. Like how? Like what we see with Jesus in Luke 24. And this becomes the whole person. And according to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is differentiating between what the pagans believe, which is there is no resurrection, the spirit just goes on. And he describes what it is in 1 Corinthians 15, where they, and 2 Corinthians chapter 8, first 3 verses. I said 2 Corinthians 8, didn't I? It's 5. I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to, because I've mentioned it, sometimes I miss a verse, and it is 2 Corinthians, it is 5. Okay, I was wrong the first time and right the second time. It's 2 Corinthians 5. And 1 Corinthians 15, Paul elaborates on what the resurrection is. It's the spirit, which is the person, the core person, and they put on further clothed. That's 2 Corinthians 5. The Greek word there is extremely rare. We find an example of it in Josephus' writings, where it says that these persons put on a burlap type shirt over their existing clothing. That's the same verb that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 5. They put on. So we put on this other body, this immortality. So you put those two together. That is what the resurrection is. Okay? All right, let's see. Trying to see where, okay. Let's see. Where else? Okay. All right. Sorry for the pause. I'm just, a lot of questions here. All right. Right. Okay. It says, in answer to your question, there is no scholarly evidence. The namesake names are the actual writers of the so-called Gospels. Most scholars think not. Well, if you ask these Bible critics, then most scholars who are not evangelicals have no idea who wrote these books. So regardless of who wrote them or what their names were, in Greek or Hebrew. I don't care what their names were. I'm talking about those 4 books. If you're going to make a claim, which did earlier, that the Jesus of those books, regardless of who wrote them, is not the Jesus of Paul, then regardless of who wrote them, give a chapter, a book, chapter, and verse that implies that what your statement was true, that the Jesus of these 4 books is not the Jesus that Paul or whoever he is. The point is not the name of the guy who wrote them. That's not the point of your claim. The point of your claim is that they are different Jesuses. That's what we haven't seen yet. We would greatly appreciate that if you make these claims, give some evidence, because that's what I'm here for, is giving the evidence for Christianity. I would like to see the evidence that you have for whatever you're claiming. Okay. So point, but if the spirit goes back to God on death, it must be alive. These spirits are described. You in English could say that they're alive, but they're the spirits of the dead. They are themselves an entity. They have some ability to be aware and active, but when in the Old Testament, when it says life, that is often the word for soul, nephesh, which is a physical thing, and that has the breath of this, we say breath of life. The Hebrew word there is often nephesh. We translate that as soul. So the spirit itself does not have the breath of life. The spirit is the spirit, and it exists, and it is the essential being of a person. So is it alive? Well, you could play with that and say it is or it isn't, because it's said to be the spirit of the dead, but it does exist. And it is said in Luke chapter 8, this is what Jesus uses, brings back the girl's spirit and raises her from the dead. And the word spirit appears there. And I believe that's Luke chapter 8, round about verse 50. Okay. SOS asks, people are suffering and dying. People are suffering and dying, not they are ignorant and don't know why. I don't understand the question. No, not the word. Okay, people are suffering and dying now. They are ignorant and don't know why. Okay, I agree with that. I think that really big to do. Okay, I'm not sure I see any new questions. May need to retype that or lengthen the question because I'm not seeing it. See, the soul is alive, but the body is dead. I believe they must be united in the final resurrection. Now, that is true. That is true. The soul, you could say it's alive. There's a couple verses that imply that word alive. There certainly can be aware and active. Absolutely. Not great activity. They have no power, according to 1 Corinthians 15. They have no power, but they can observe and react. That is true in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. We see that in Acts 23, where the Pharisees say that that maybe a dead spirit has spoken to Paul, because these Pharisees hang together and they're trying to divide off the Sadducees. And so they say, who knows, maybe a dead spirit, meaning the spirit of a dead person, has spoken to Paul. We see in Matthew 14, round about verse 20, when Jesus walks on the water. The disciples thought they saw that word there is not the word spirit, it's the word phantasma, which is the Greek word for ghost. They thought they saw a ghost, or the equivalent of Hebrew Repha, which is a spirit-like thing. And they thought that that's who was walking along the water. This is proof that the Jews, or at least the Pharisees, believed that the dead, not physical, but spirit, can indeed do things and move. Okay. All right. Yeah. Bart Ehrman, right. SOS mentions, I think he meant Ehrman, not Ehrman, Ehrman. And yeah, Bart is a critic. He's no longer a Christian. Okay. So if you ask those who are not Christian if they're Christian, they're going to say no. Okay. So if you study just the scholars who are not Christian, you're going to get a non-Christian view. Absolutely true. All right. Right. The identities of the men is not a matter of faith. What is taught is that's what we care about, is what they taught. We don't need to have to know who wrote them. Knowing their names is absolutely irrelevant. Right. Okay. We do not, good comment here. We do not know the identities of the authors of many books of the Old Testament, but they all are quoted as being inspired and as true. And yes, we think it's likely that those who wrote many of the books of the Old Testament were of the Levitical class, more of the priestly class, descendants of Aaron. I don't know their names, but these are the ones that had that commission to write and preserve those books. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. If the gospel writer names are wrong or don't matter, that is a big man. Well, if you think that that's true, SOS, that it hinges on knowing their names, they're given names that their parents gave them. If that's what your conscience says, then you need to believe. Go for it. But I would say anybody who looks at what the evidence that we're presenting here, or I'm presenting here, and along with Mav and GROW and others presenting, if that doesn't work for you, then what does work for you? Do you have another belief system? Okay, and I'll be interested in it if it has as much or more evidence in Christianity, has as good or better ethical system, and offers the same or better future hope. You got all three? Tell me about it. Ask a question. Say, Jay, have you heard of this? Give me some information of some better belief system. Because right now, as I stand here, I've read so much of different world competing views. I was in another viewpoint, got out of that, and being a member of ETS, I get tremendous amounts of information. As I said, 650 papers at the PhD level per year. So that's, now I've been in it for 30 years. Well, for 15 to 20 years of that, I've been getting all 650. That's a lot of information. And I have never, ever, never, ever, never come across another belief system that comes anywhere close to competing with Christianity. So if there's one, something, as I said, all those three things, better evidence for it, a future hope, right? And ethics, very important, a better ethical system. And I love, if you've got questions about the ethics, I love defending that topic. I get it. They say, well, I'm not convinced of the ethics of Christianity. I get it, because mainstream Christianity is also struggling with the ethics of the Bible. I get that. But I claim I can answer all those questions that challenge the mainstream Christian community on ethics. I get it. I know about the differences, but that's why we have this show. That's why it's live. That's why you can type in questions, or after this is uploaded, you can go over to YouTube and type in more questions. I love questions that challenge any of those three, either the basis for the texts, the hope of the kingdom, any of that, or the ethics that is in Old Testament, New Testament. Love to talk about any of that. But if you can't beat those three, it's just hard for me to get motivated, because I have researched the facts on those three areas for mainstream Christianity. I used my critical thinking skills. I think I do have critical thinking skills. They've been put to test. And if you believe differently, then make your point. So it's this competition of the truth. Well, if you've got another belief system and that has as good or more truth, or if you say little things mean the most, I make your case. I'm not convinced that the little things mean the most. Where is your logic using critical thinking skills that says little things mean the most? As I look at anything, if I'm in a courtroom, I've been on a jury, but let's say I was in a jury and they're trying to present things. Little things are little things. The people, when they're giving their testimony, they may leave out little things. The human mind may miss a little thing. I'm looking for the big things. So did Jesus exist? Now, Bart Ehrman says Jesus existed. He does indeed. You can find a YouTube on that. He says it's he's real. So that's the big thing. Okay. All right. Here's a question from Maverick, future question. 2 Thessalonians 2:11, therefore God sends them a strong delusion so they may believe what is false. I want to know your views. I have some views we can discuss. Yes. Oh, very interesting about a delusion. That implies, now, and that's in the context, I mean, I have time. That's in the context of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 of the Greek word is apostasis, an apostasy or a separating of the Christian community and on a bigger scale people about what is true and what is false. And any time of history, I don't know of any time where we as a planet wonder about just simply what is true and what is false, especially with AI, and that they can create videos of things that just beyond imagination that appear to be true. And it's a time where people who don't know and haven't studied can be deceived and tricked unless you are very careful in being a seeker. Okay, let's see. Says a question, it would be getting into the ethics of God. A loving father is not going to cause his child to jump hoops or struggle through a maze leading to suffering and death. With a question mark, is a loving father going to force through a maze? Okay, if this loving father has the power to change reality and raise the dead, and he's trying to get his children to become special, to become self-sacrificial, to become mentors in the kingdom, yeah, he will put up barriers and hurdles. That's why they have in track, you have hurdles to jump because it's part of your training. This world that we are seeing is major part of our training for those of us who are seekers, so that we can become inheritors along with his son. Okay, so yes, that is indeed why this is happening, because there is a God who has the power over death, and we can postpone the worries and cares of the day because of the hope of what Christ said is tomorrow. And if you've got a better belief system, like I say, I haven't heard that better belief system that explains what I'm seeing, why I see this world the way it is, and why there is sin and why there is suffering. The Bible explains all of this. I am not aware, that's absolutely true, I'm not aware of any other belief system that answers all the questions and gives me hope. What belief system would you propose that answers all these questions, that gives me those three things: evidence for the belief system, the ethics of this belief system, and the hope for the future? Tell me. Okay. All right. Your answer is not reasonable. Okay. No father is going to deliberately inflict torture. It's not inflicting torture. Yes, he is. Once man sinned and chose death, God will allow temporary suffering. You say torture. God is not inflicting torture. It is a consequence of sin. It is all temporary. And death, we see death as being permanent. It's not. It is temporary. It's like taking a nap. Have I ever sent my kids to bed to settle down? Yes, often. Sent my kids, and because the nap was temporary. So is life. Same as someone gets sick and they need an operation. Do I send them to the doctor? You bet. And if he says we're going to do surgery, okay, they're going to put the child to sleep. And I tell the child, you're going to wake up, you'll be better. Okay, I've done that. I said, you will be better. And sure enough, the doctor put them to sleep, brought them back, and they were better. So would a loving father do that? Yes, this is no father is going to do that. Fathers will do that. They will send their son to a doctor where there is some pain, and they put them to sleep, and then they wake up and they're better again. Fathers do that every day. Okay. All right. All right. I guess. Wow, we've covered a lot of questions. We still have more time. That was fun. Okay. All starting with the topic of Gnostics. Who knew in advance the outcome of mankind? Who planned it? Right. A warm-hearted father. A father will have his children, put them in situations knowing where this is going to go, put them in challenging situations. I did it with my kids, put them in challenging situations so that they could build this character. And I guess character is the best way, their character, their ethics, and challenge themselves to do good things. And God started that in the Garden of Eden. And I'm full on with that. I find it a warm-hearted father, and I thank God for the challenges. And through this, because of the hope of the resurrection, it's going to be really nice. And again, what viewpoint is superior to the one that I'm portraying here in this show, this call-in show? All right. Maverick says this delusion could have something to do with UFOs and encounters. Yep. There are a lot of odd things going on. Yep. And I don't know. I'm waiting to see. AI seems to be the ultimate delusion right now of the capacity to make it other people to look like, maybe this looks like my relative speaking in the voice that I know. You have to have code. You have to have 2-point verification to know that who the person is I'm talking to. Well, I need some confirmation here. What happened 25 years ago out in the backyard, before I know who you are, right? Yeah, are all these billions of people part of the Father's plan? Absolutely. Absolutely. All the people down through time faced challenges. And what did they do with those challenges? Then they fell asleep in death. The scriptures say that. And then in the resurrection, they will be there. And those who have said, I want no part of God's plan, his ethics, I would rather be dead forever than be in God's world where there is Jesus ruling, this person that was willing to die for me, that gave all of himself, the one who said, the one who would be greatest must get on your knees and wash your feet. I want that guy in charge. And anybody says, nope, I want no part of that, I don't want to be there, they won't be there. So that's God's plan in a short nutshell, because there is going to be a kingdom and everyone will be raised. And some, those that have rejected God's ethics, have never had a kind thought for another person, they won't be there. And it's a wonderful plan. Okay. Let's see what else we've got here in the remaining time. I've talked about Gnostics. I think that's all of the all we need there. And if there's more I've missed about the Gnostics, then I need more questions, better questions. Okay. All right.
Do you think the Jehovah's Witness notion of the resurrection as portrayed in the drawings is a Gnostic resurrection or a reincarnation? Or do you think in some way it has any Bible basis?
The resurrection that they portray in the artwork of people being raised on earth, that goes back to the historic premillennialism. I can say that by the end of the first century is when we see that imprint for Christians who taught a earthly paradise where people are raised in perfection. That's after, of course, obviously after the cross. Before the time of the cross, we see it in the book of Isaiah. So the idea of a Christian, kingdom that is like Garden of Eden, because Isaiah and Ezekiel both mention that. This is biblical, of a paradise earth where people are raised from the dead. It's in the Old Testament, Ezekiel and Isaiah, and then also in the New Testament, and reflected in early Christian writings starting in the late first century. So yes, their artwork is pretty good. The problem with the Watchtower is that they believe in the eternal divorce. That, for example, Mary, mother of Jesus, and the other brothers, we know that Jesus also had sisters, but his brothers, James and Jude, James, we say James, it's actually Jacob, will be locked in heaven. I'm one of the 144,000, and poor Joseph and other little kiddos, and maybe the sisters, if they died young, they're going to be raised on earth, and these families are going to be eternally separated. That's the view of the Watchtower that is not consistent with Scripture. So the Watchtower's artwork is pretty good. And Gnostics would not have anybody physical, because the Gnostic view is that all are spiritual, which is like the Watchtower teaching for the 144,000. They are all spiritual. Now that part is Gnostic. So the Watchtower is a combination of biblical truth, but with Gnosticism as far as the 144,000. Okay. SOS has got a question here. Oh, thank you for asking that. SOS's question: who among mankind is capable of saying yes or no in any age of time? Well, according to Romans chapter 4 and 5, everyone, except little children maybe, but everyone can appreciate good and bad. They have a conscience from God, and they can look at things and say, this seems good, this seems bad. It is wrong for me to take a whacking stick and beat on people or steal from them. Okay, that's bad. It is wrong to be involved in human trafficking and involved in being a drug lord or a big higher up in organized crime. This is bad. So those folks have made statements. Children don't make those kind of decisions. That's why in Matthew chapter 19, around about verse 2 or 3, Jesus said, all the children, the kingdom belongs to them. They will be in the kingdom, because they don't make those kind of choices. But other people do. They make the kind of choices that you see mentioned, listed by Jesus in Matthew 25, the story of the sheep and the goats. So that's Matthew 25, beginning in verse 31 to the end of the chapter. They can be put into two categories. The goats, according to the text there, never had a kind thought in their heads. Never had a loving, compassionate, kind thought in their heads. They are the goats. The other people had times of kind thoughts about others. They are called sheep. And in there, this is the first parable in Matthew there, 24 and 25. The first time Jesus uses the word righteous. They are proclaimed righteous because they had compassionate thoughts. And it says they will inherit into the kingdom. Okay, very simple. So anybody through time who became an adult who could make make a choice about other people, if they never, ever, never, ever had a compassionate thought, they are goats. They won't be in the kingdom. Everybody else will be in the parousia kingdom. It's a number of names: parousia kingdom, messianic kingdom, millennial kingdom, same thing, or transitional kingdom. This is the kingdom from Jesus coming again until, according to 1 Corinthians 15:28, until the time when Jesus hands back the kingdom to his Father. That time period is the millennial kingdom. That's one name. The parousia kingdom, that's the term I like. So yes, they could make those kind of choices and end up in the kingdom. So it's a wonderful view. I don't see anything problem with it. To me, that's a very loving God. But those who in this life never, ever had a compassionate, kind thought, and their only thinking was killing people all the time, sounds like the flood, or many of the people in the flood, they will not be there, and they wouldn't want to be there. If they're offered a life in the kingdom where they can't hurt, oppress other people, torture other people, they're not going to be happy. So God is not going to force them to be there. So they're not going to be there. Okay. Okay. Yes, it's been a marathon. I love it. I appreciate those who are hanging in there. Okay, let's see. Okay, Maverick has the Genesis, Revelation, Nephilim, Nimrod, NASA, Flat Earth, and more. See, that's the thing, is that there's so many different ideas, and thankfully, these kind of deceptions don't involve ethics. I hope people who believe in these fairy tales, funny things that are not real, it doesn't affect their ethics, and that they're still kind and loving. And if a person is kind and loving, I don't care what they believe about the shape of the earth. But there is a delusion, and sadly, it seems to me, sadly, it is affecting people in their ethics, what they believe is right and wrong and good and just. And oh, that's sad. That's happening today. I'm seeing it. Let's see. The Bible, yes or no? How about the retarded, the sick, the deformed, the old, and the other religious beliefs? Okay. Again, according to the sheep and the goats parable, Matthew 25, beginning 31 and onward, and in Romans chapters 4 and 5, Paul says the very same thing. There's a case where Paul in Romans reflects what Jesus said in the story of the sheep and the goats. Same thing, that those who are like children, as you said, retarded, that's not a word that, cognitively impaired is a better word. The sick, the deformed, the old, and all of these folks, regardless of their religious beliefs, the shape of the earth, whatever, if they did the best with what they had. And according to Paul, there's Paul again in Acts 17, it says God overlooks what would be considered sin. He does not, I repeat, does not hold them accountable to their sin. Paul says that again in Romans 4 and around about verse 12, and Romans 5 around about verse 12, that God overlooks and does not hold them account. I repeat, does not hold them accountable for these sins. And they are therefore granted entrance into the parousia kingdom. So regardless of their religious beliefs, their whatever, if they, the word ignorant comes in because that's what the word Paul uses in Acts 17, verse 30 and 31, is that those who are uninformed, ignorant, the sins are overlooked. And that's what the purpose of the parousia kingdom is. So all these folks, I expect to see in the parousia kingdom. And those who in this life latch on to God's ethics, are challenged by the things that happen in their life, but they step over them, depending upon the Holy Spirit, depending upon God, depending on God's ethics, who step over those problems and endure, they become the mentors in the kingdom. They become the disciplers. Because if you read Matthew 24, end of Matthew 24, the parable there, or in Luke 12, round about verse 40 through 48, those who have been doing the will of Christ in this life get to carry on those works in the kingdom. They continue doing what they're doing here. What are they doing here? Making disciples, mentoring. What do they get to continue doing in the kingdom? Making disciples, mentoring. This is echoed from Daniel 12, where Daniel says, in the kingdom, there will be those who will turn many to righteousness. That means they weren't righteous before. So those in the resurrection that were successful conquerors is the word Jesus uses. We also see that in Revelation chapter 2. The full, but anyway, those who are conquerors in this life get to be mentors, disciple conquerors in the kingdom. And who are they interacting with? They're interacting with those who have been raised, the children, the ones who have cognitive disabilities, those that were confused in this life, listed in these passages that I just referenced. So and if you've got a better system based on as much evidence as I have for the Bible, I want to hear it. Okay. Is it likely the devil is one of the angels that materialized and had hybrid children with the women on earth? I think that's very possible. Interesting. This relates to another question that has come up about what about the Satan in Genesis? The Satan, that's the pronunciation, sorry. Hasatan, the Satan, the resistor. That's not a guy's name. It may not even be a unique identifier. It means resistor. So who is the resistor in Genesis? Okay, it's a resistor. And if you get a hold of Michael Heiser's book, sorry he's passed on, but Michael Heiser in his book, Unseen Realm, he brings out this material about who the Satan is in Genesis, that he's one of the divine council. Before he was the resistor in Genesis chapter 3 there, he would have been one of the divine council. These angelic beings that God has made, that are observing, who are given opportunities to make ethical choices on who they will support. Will they support God's and God's plan for the future, or will they want to experiment and come up with their own? And thus begins the story. So that's something I recommend if you don't have the time to dig into that. Great book. I went through it a couple times. So it's Michael Heiser, The Unseen Realm. There's other derivative books that are kind of interesting, books on demons. I haven't read that one, but Unseen Realm is a great place to start. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Grow says the sheep and goats are not separated by their belief in Christ. Yes, that's right. Instead, the sheep are those who perform works of mercy for the poor and downtrodden, and the goats are those who did not. Wonderful. That's precisely the point. It's not about how much faith they put in the Christ that they knew. That is not, all you got to do is go read Matthew 25, beginning of 31, and get out your pencil and look for whether it referenced they knew Christ. It doesn't say that they knew Christ. They are unaware, but because they did merciful things, as I said before, in this series of these parables, this is the first time Jesus labels them as righteous. What an awesome God we serve. All right. Maverick says he loves the biblical cosmology and pre-flood study. That is really interesting stuff. In that case, most of the Pharisees were goats. Yeah, you see, that is a problem, isn't it? The more you know, there's a higher accountability. Jesus says that in Luke 12 in these parables. Those who know what to do and don't do it are in serious trouble. So that's why the Pharisees are goats, because they had opportunities to show mercy. They knew the Old Testament law, Leviticus 19, love your neighbors yourself, and they couldn't put that together, and they refused to do it. They are in deep trouble, the goats. Okay. It says, what in your understanding is the end result of the non-sheep or goats? Does the revelation apply to them? The rest of that sheep and goats in Matthew 25 says that those who had never a kind thought, obviously they would be adults, capability of processing information and reacting to other people, so that we'll call them adults, and they will not have a compassionate thought, even though they had plenty of opportunities to come to them. It says there that they end up in the lake of fire. So yes, that's their path, and they would obviously not be happy in the world that Jesus describes as being the kingdom, because that's a place of loving and being kind and self-sacrifice, and they would be miserable there. Why would God bring them? They don't want to be miserable, so they just go off into. Now I hold to the view, it's a minority view. Okay, I've mentioned this before. I hold to the view called conditional immortality, that their life just terminates. I do not believe in eternal conscious torment. So these goats, they go into, and they are non-functioning for eternity, which is not much different than atheists believe in anyway. So if you tell an atheist that they're going to die like an atheist, what's the problem? Okay. Greatest of all time false prophets. That's cute. Goats, right? Let's see. King of Dots says, being kind makes me miserable. Okay, that's one belief system. It's not my belief system. Oh, maybe you're talking about the goats. Being kind makes them miserable. Yeah, okay, but you said me, so I'm not sure what that means. Let's see, would people still have wicked thoughts in the millennial reign after the demons have been removed? Jesus is going to rule with an iron rod. Yes, he will be ruling with an iron rod. Now, if you read Zechariah, we get hints that people that have let's answer that question. Will people be capable of having wicked thoughts? In the Garden of Eden, without the influence of Satan, did Adam and Eve have disobedient thoughts? Yes. Was it because of the curse? No. So is it possible that in the kingdom, in the millennial reign, parousia kingdom, will they have the possibility of having disobedient thoughts? Yes. Isaiah implies that. Zechariah implies that. There will be some coaching, some mentoring, but they've got to convert, otherwise they're out. Even though the demons have been removed, and Jesus is going to rule with an iron rod. Now, that iron rod, the ruling, that word for rule in the Old Testament, and you correlate it with the New Testament, that word can mean shepherding. Don't think of it as bang, bang, bang on the head. That in the original language meant to shepherd. It doesn't mean to whack them in the head. Okay? But yes, Jesus and the others, because it says there in Revelation chapter 2, round about verse 15, that his followers will also be giving a rod to rule. Now, the bad guys, they will get a whacking. It says whacking the nations, the authorities. Those that try to compete with Jesus, they are going to get whacked. Yes? All right. SOS asks, what is Jesus going to do with the governing body, and is they in line for the eternal lake of fire? Okay, and first of all, I always check when someone asks me a question, what is Jesus going to do to a person? I got to be careful because my Lord commanded me not to judge, pass judgment. There's the word judge means, in English, means to evaluate. To pass judgment is more closer to what the Greek word means. I'm not going to pass judgment on them. I suspect they're in deep trouble because of their cruelty. They are held to a higher standard. They are exposed to Scripture. They teach it, and yet the cruel things that they do, I won't say what's going to happen to them because my Lord says, don't you pass judgment. So I won't pass judgment. I'll say that if I see him in the kingdom, I will be very much surprised and I will be curious to hear an explanation. But I suspect that they're all going to be in serious kind of trouble. And I would, if I could speak to them, I would recommend that they rethink their actions because they have treaded onto dangerous ground. Why do I say that? Because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, the Sermon on the Mount, around about verse 21, 22, he says, many on that day, how many? Many, not few, handful, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not? And he says, get away from me, I do not know who you are. That's an indication of the lake of fire. So, now, as I said, I don't believe in eternal conscious torment or torturing. I believe in there'll be sadness. They will see where they go in their punishment, that they're in line for the second death. What is it? It's the death of the spirit, and they're gone. And maybe they're going to be happy with that. I don't know. I can't imagine being happy missing out on the kingdom, but maybe they'll be happy about it. But that's where they belong. And we'll all say goodbye to them. Their souls will melt away in the lake of fire. Right. Very nice. I like that, King of Dots. Okay. You said you do mean you, that you do not, you miserable being kind to others. Not sure I understand that, but okay. King of Dots, kindness never helped anyone on welfare. They stay there, count me out. Okay, I don't know what that means. My wife and I have shown kindness in the numbers of thousands of dollars. I mortgaged my home so that I could help folks who would otherwise be homeless, help them with thousands of dollars. Maybe I shouldn't have said that because, oh, you're bragging. I don't mean to be bragging, but just to show that it's real. Maybe I should have said, I know somebody that mortgaged their home to help folks that would otherwise be homeless. Okay, enough of that. I'm not talking about, this is not about me. I just want to say there are Christians I've known who have gone out on a limb to show kindness to help those, help them in a real way. All right. Let's see. Did Jesus say, come to me, all you who are burdened and loaded down? Yeah. If you are hurting, Jesus has hope. He demonstrates the kind of hope that he offers. When he was here, he healed, he did some amazing things. He did not set up hospitals to heal everybody. That wasn't his point. It was rather to teach ethics of how to get to that hospital, the kingdom, where all these problems will be fixed. Because remember, to God, death is not the end of the road. It's like taking a nap. Okay. Okay. Maverick says they will be locked up in Beth Sarim forever. How funny. I've been to Beth Sarim, by the way. I drove through, was it El Cajon in San Diego? I used to live in San Diego. So I went there once. And I actually had a Kodak camera, the kind that you can take the film instantly. That was funny. Huh? Yes, Polaroid. My wife reminded me of the Polaroid camera. Right. With Rutherford. How funny. Oh, forever. That would be a terrible thing, wouldn't it? Okay. Obey the laws of the superior authorities. That's the judgment. Yes, obeying the laws of the superior authorities. Of course, the superior authorities, according to Rutherford, were the civil authorities, but the superior authorities Rutherford thought the superior authorities were the demonic authorities, but Romans 13 has the superior authorities being the civil authorities, not the demonic. Okay, not sure what you meant there, King of Dots. Okay. Yeah, correct, Donietta. The JW governing body are just businessmen. Yes, but they sure can be cruel. Okay. Let's see. Why do we need people to be punished to be happy? I don't understand that. I don't need to be punished to be happy. We need people to interact with so that we can respond as Jesus did, to where he saw people that needed help and he got on his knees and washed their feet. Okay. Okay, money is a way to show kindness. Yeah, we are limited. I maybe have great physical limitations. I can't do some things for people, but if I've got extra cash, I can help them and show them how to budget their money and do helpful things. Yep, been there, done that. Okay, we are running out of time, is moving on, but we got questions. Yeah, who lives in Beth Sarim now? I don't know. It was years and years ago that I was there. It says, I'm an ex-Catholic. I know charity doesn't work. It can help some people. I've seen it help some. It can. Okay. We are, as it says, we're getting a midnight here in in the UK. So it's probably about time to wrap it up. All right. So we are past the time of 7. I've enjoyed the evening. Thank you, everybody. And SOS, you too. Thank you for these are questions about ethics. Those are some of my favorite questions. And SOS, you have given some of the best questions consistently over months now of stimulating conversation, everybody diving in and wanting to do it. And my only question to you is, if you come across a better belief system that's got more evidence for believing in it, a better ethics, and a hope for the future, tell me about it. I'm curious. Okay. We're going to call it there for the evening. I do have some questions still to cover. Next time, we'll do the best I can. And but Rick, I think we're there.
Well, my goodness gracious, Jay, you're doing a great job on there. You get more and more people coming in. We really appreciate what you do for us at the 6 Cranes. Thank you very much. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
We'll see you in 2 weeks. All righty.
Good man. Thank you, Jay. Keep cranking away at it. And don't you ever let your visions die. We love you, Jay. Thank you.
I love you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Well, I just want to say, too, thank you, everyone, for coming into the 6 Screens of the Watchtower programs this weekend. And we certainly hate to see the end of it. I know a lot of people on here say, well, Rick, keep going on, but we can only do so much. But thank you all for coming in and wanting to participate. And all those that called in over the weekend, thank you very much. And all of you people that didn't, try to muster up the courage and call in. It would be so encouraging if you could do that. Thank you very much for being part of the 6 Screens of the Watchtower. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week right here on the 6 Screens Tele Network.